evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Deep Issues number 25. It's day 5183 in the search for Tim Shovelday. Like I mentioned before, this is Deep Issues, webisode number 25. Why? I'm your host, Josh Houslander. With me, as always, our producer, the heart and soul of everything here at theempiremedia.com, Adam Hernandez, and our Deep Issues expert, Mr. Edwin Zaharsky. How's it going, guys? What's up?
Good. It's awesome.
Yeah. Cool. I'm glad. Ed was nodding, and when I asked him that question, how he was doing, it's like he doesn't quite understand that like nodding into the microphone doesn't quite come across as a yes.
We're on live too.
but he got it across. He eventually did throw out a yes. But hey, tonight's topic, and Ed is going to be key in tonight's topic. Hopefully, he doesn't nod through it all. But tonight's topic is Federal Reserve, fractional reserve banking, usury, anything that comes into that topic as a whole. Ed, do you want me to start, or do you have something that you want to?
Either way.
Okay, I mean, we're going to talk about Federal Reserve tonight as our main topic, and we're going to give some of the history behind it. We're going to give some of the pros, cons, ups, downs. We're also going to discuss some of the maybe potential conspiracy that's behind, not it itself, but the reasoning for it, if you will. But Federal Reserve, let's just kind of give like a brief run through. I'm going to give like a brief run through some of the history of it, but I have a feeling Ed's going to have some much better info, because my stuff is kind of really, really basic here, so I just kind of want to break it down. But, what is the Fed? When did it begin? This stuff, and people ask, when did this all happen? This definitely does not date back to 1776 or 1789. This is, the Fed begins on December 23rd, 1913. Not 2013, it's not that young. But 12/23/13 is when the Fed begins, started by Woodrow Wilson. But there were incarnations of this type of thing all throughout American history. Alexander Hamilton, one of our founding fathers, was a supporter of a central banking system, if you will. Some modern people actually refer to Alexander Hamilton as a socialist. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that, but it's out there. From 1791 to 1811, the first Bank of the United States is in existence, but it is voted out in 1811. It's brought back in 1816, but then Andrew Jackson, 7th President of the United States, first ever Democrat president of the United States, he runs on the idea of eliminating a national bank, and it goes away again in 1836. It comes back, it's talked about throughout a lot of things, but it comes back again in 1863 to pay for the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln opposes it staying. He opposes it coming into existence. He's later assassinated. Does that have something to do with it? I'm not making that claim, but some have made said claim. And, again, still battled about, and in 1913 brought back about. 1914, World War I begins, and then, it helps to fund some of what's going on during World War I. In 1917, the United States actually does enter World War I. 1933, FDR now brings in some more things. The FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, is brought about. 1973, we kind of officially get rid of the gold standard. That's just a little bit of background. Ed, when in your history stuff, and I know you have some good info here, if you feel like you're overlapping, don't feel like you can't tell us more because I already said something.
One of the things in there was what sort of precipitated the Federal Reserve Act in 1913 was the Panic of 1907, which basically there was a big stock market crash. It went down over like 50% from where it was. Its current high was, I think, within the previous year. And that basically got the ball moving towards, hey, we need to have this sort of central bank that can sort of control all these ups and downs and sort of stabilize our economy. And that's kind of the way it's been sold. Is that, as you sort of outlined, basically since the inception of this country, there's been sort of a fight for that central bank. Like the bankers have really pushed to have this sort of control in that regard. And there's been quite a bit of opposition to that. And then after 1913, it's basically,
1907 is a very strange time for the United States as well. The progressive movement is kind of starting as a bit of a grassroots movement, if you will. Taft is our president, who was basically the chosen successor of Theodore Roosevelt, a very popular president. And although he was a very patriotic Republican, he was also very progressive. Theodore Roosevelt chooses Taft. He's not crazy with the way Taft is running things. And in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt decides to run as a third party, the Progressive Party, commonly known as the Bull Moose Party, but really it's the Progressive Party of the United States. He's a very popular man here in Michigan. He actually wins Michigan as technically a third-party candidate. Taft and him, in essence, split the vote, and Woodrow Wilson becomes president. Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, but also a progressive, becomes president of the United States. And in essence, you have what was a country that was very much Republican at the time. About 60 to 65% of the country at this point are identifying as Republicans, but we have a Democratic president because Teddy and Taft split the vote. And we have a progressive Democrat become president of the United States in 1912.
And Woodrow Wilson was actually running basically against the idea of the Federal Reserve, and then basically did a 180. I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but essentially said that later in his life he regretted making that decision to basically allow that.
Yeah. This was a kind of a common thing for Woodrow Wilson kind of becoming president of the United States, because also in 1916 Woodrow Wilson runs for re-election under the campaign slogan of "He kept you out of war with Europe," because World War I is raging. 1916, he wins the election in November. 1917, we declare war on Germany. So this is kind of a theme going on with Woodrow Wilson.
Might lead you to believe maybe he was a pawn.
Perhaps.
Maybe not.
Yeah, maybe not.
So one of the big issues, so I mean, you might, if you're maybe a big government guy, you might say, hey, what's wrong with the central bank? What's wrong with the government controlling it? It's outlined basically that Congress should essentially be the ones, making our money. So, what if we have some part of the government that essentially does something like that?
Yeah, and again, a central bank, not technically unconstitutional. It's just to be decided and regulated by Congress.
Yes.
The duly elected representatives of the people.
Which it is currently not.
Correct.
Even though the Federal Reserve is called the Federal Reserve, you can't say it's entirely not a government entity, but it's not a government entity. It's basically a sort of cover facade the way it actually plays out, which I don't know if you want me to get into.
Please do. Please do.
So basically, it's privately owned. You have the U.S. Treasury, legit 100% government agency. Then you have the Fed, which is broken down into basically 12 regional branches. All of the branches have stockholders, of which it's not a publicly traded stock. They're basically all banks. You can Google this. If you Google stockholders of the Federal Reserve, you can actually get a list from its inception in 1913 all the way to current day of essentially who these stockholders are. And basically, these are the ones who, they're private corporations who make money off the bank. So the way the money originally starts is essentially, so say we have our budget comes out this year, and, you know, of course, because our government loves to spend, we're short $100 million. Well, we need to make that. Essentially, the Fed sort of makes a deposit into their banks, you know, which essentially all these member banks, and they can lend it out. Now, it's fractional reserve. We don't, you know, we're done with the silver and the gold standard, so you don't have to have anything else backing it up. The only requirement is you keep 10% of your reserve that you have. So, you know, you've got $100 million, you only have to keep 10 million in the bank. Now, sort of where the shady bookkeeping comes in, say I'm the bank and I lend you $100, and you say, cool, I'm gonna throw that in my bank account. You turn around and you give that to me. Well, then I get this $100. I can basically loan out 90 of that to, say, Adam. And so what's happening is they make this initial deposit and they just continuously re-loan this money out time and time again throughout all of these banks, essentially creating 9 to 10 times the amount of money that was initially created by the Fed. On top of that, they're charging interest rate. So you essentially have, it's not really money that's being created, it's essentially debt that's being created, and it's being created by private banks, which then, you know, this isn't really a government entity at this point. Another thing about the Fed is basically they've never been audited in their entire history.
Not once.
So even though you can get a list of who is basically a stakeholder in any of these branches, you can't really tell how much or what they own. So you might look at it and say, well, hey, there's state banks in there, you know, the Bank of Michigan, the Bank of Ohio, whatever, you know, they own shares in it. Okay, you know they might, and so maybe in some form that makes it a government entity. You see other banks on there who most definitely aren't, and it is known that there are 5 banks basically that contain essentially about half of all the reserves of Federal Reserve notes, which basically means they have most of the money that they can lend out. So like JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Citigroup, US Bancorp, those don't sound like government entities to me.
No.
So, I mean, so money is just, it's an abstract concept. You know, it means whatever we want it to mean. You know, we use it to barter with. It just represents, you know, labor, goods,
wealth,
land. Yeah. And it's whatever we want it to be is what it can be. You can't create that though. Like you can't make that out of nothing, you know. And that's basically what they're doing. They're taking money that doesn't exist. They're in turn lending it out, charging interest on it. When that money comes back in, they then turn around and re-lend that same money out. So essentially you have these private banks, these wealthy private banks that create money, get it all back along with interest. Also, each member of each stockholder of the Federal Reserve is paid basically 6% dividends flat yearly, which doesn't change.
Money.
Yes, and if somehow, say, the Fed were to completely end, dissolve, whatever, the money that these banks pay to become a member is 100% guaranteed, so it is paid back to them. So it is essentially a foolproof 6%. If you look at, I mean, if you play the stock market, you might, if you're a really good investor, get 10% year in, year out. As far as dividends, straight up dividends, though, you'll never receive 10% dividends. You might get a couple percent. You know, some of the top companies don't pay more than 3 or 4% dividends. So that's on top of the money that they're making, that they're basically creating out of nowhere and then getting interest on as their straight 6%.
Okay. One of the questions I have, Ed, is this is spelled out pretty clearly in the Constitution. Why does Congress, the voice of the people in essence, why does Congress give up its power so willingly?
I would say that pretty much, probably most of them at this point are in the pocketbooks of a lot of these large banks. There is a committee of 7 people who head up basically I think it's like the chair of the Federal Reserve. Theoretically, if you had the correct people on there, you could enact some sort of change from within. The problem is they have, is it 14-year terms, and they're basically appointed by the president every 2 years. So you have 7 people on there. In order to get a majority, in favor of whatever it would be, you would have to appoint 4 people. So you basically have to have a president who had 2 terms, got the guys they wanted, and didn't have any sort of outside influence, basically, pushing them one way or the other.
You have to have a couple of presidents in a row do this.
Yes, and I don't think it takes a genius to realize that I don't think any of our presidents have.
Because I feel like people that are prone to say that, well, government's corrupt. I'm one of those people. Mm-hmm. But that, the government, they don't care about the little guy. They just care about power, right? Care about power. So if Congress and our government that we are admittedly not trusting are giving up their power so willingly, you almost have to assume that there's some corruption going on here, right? That there's something going on. Why would these guys, who we all kind of acknowledge, they're striving for power, yet they give this bit of power up so easily?
Mm-hmm. I mean, we paid billions. I think it's somewhere in the amount of like 300 or 400 billion just in interest at this point. That money goes from the U.S. Treasury, so we collect this in taxes, and goes into the Fed, which is then, to the various banks. That money goes to private banks, so it isn't exactly accurate to say, we owe it to ourselves. Like, it's, it's no big deal. Like, us doing this is actually basically giving our money away. And on top of that, when you create this new money, that's what causes inflation. If there are $1,000 in circulation and we do nothing to change the amount of goods or labor or any other factors, and we double the amount of money, that money is worth half of what it used to be. So in a sense, this works as sort of like a tax on the poor. Every year as this happens, that wage you make, it's actually less than it was the year before. That's why things like cost of living and inflation are as high as they are.
By the standards I've seen, and maybe either one of you two are smarter with numbers than I am, because numbers are not my forte. I fully admit that I'm not. But from what I've seen, the dollar in 1913, according to inflation, is worth approximately 4 cents in 2018. That's what inflation has done, and that obviously, I mean, I think a lot of people would agree with that when they've seen cost of living, standard of living, and purchasing power, especially from, I mean, obviously nobody was buying stuff in 1913, buying stuff now. It was 105 years ago. But we saw what our parents could do. We saw what our grandparents could do with it. Excuse me. We heard what our grandparents' parents could do with it, from talking with people and family and those older than we, So, I mean, that's always the number I've heard is $1 in 1913. Purchasing power-wise is worth about 4 cents now.
That sounds about right. I've heard various figures, but basically it's usually about like 1 to 4 cents. Essentially, the idea is it's almost worthless compared to what it used to be. And people will point to and say, well, wages are higher and other things have gone up, but it's not all proportional. Like, I mean, we were having an off-air discussion, about, briefly with Dorf.
From Politics of the Empire. Hopefully you guys tuned into that.
About him moving to Minnesota and being the breadwinner, and you can't really do that anymore. And that's there are other factors, obviously, we talked about last time than that. But even with 2 incomes at this point, it's almost not the same as it was with 1 income prior, because things have changed so much. It's, I mean, the dollar, I mean, it's worthless compared to what it used to be.
Yeah.
And So there are a lot of, I guess, ideas on, like, what should be done. Why should we, obviously this isn't right. We're basically just funneling all of our money away from us into all these banks. That's essentially what it is. It's almost like a Ponzi scheme. Like, it's the way it's set up. I mean, people are almost destined to fail. I mean, you can't, even if you invest well, that's about the only way that maybe you can keep up, and maybe you play the stocks and you hit 10%, but that's a gamble. Like, I mean, you can't just put in an honest day's work, make your money, throw it under your mattress, and then retire off it, because it's going to be worth shit when you go to retire if you do that.
No, you're right. I mean, the idea of honest days, honest days pay for an honest day's work, and then you make an honest living is no. You got to have something else. You got to have an inheritance coming in from somewhere. You have to have some sort of investment. You have to pull some sort of trick. Quite frankly, some bit of gambling, legalized gambling perhaps, but some bit of gambling just to truly further yourself.
I mean, as you kind of pointed out in the beginning, like, this is why there has been so much of a fight against a central bank throughout not just our nation's history, but this went on in Europe, in many nations for centuries before then, because it's well known that this is essentially what happens. It bankrupts a country.
I mean, you hear the term, it's why the rich get richer, but you can, when you kind of dissect the idea of the Federal Reserve or central banking, you will see that it is in essence a upward distribution of wealth on a systemic level.
Yes.
I mean, in essence is what you're looking at. And you have Democrats who want to scream about, hey, we need to, protect the little guy. You have Republicans screaming, yay, capitalism, but it's neither.
No,
it's neither. This isn't capitalism. I mean, and I feel like this is the big debate, capitalism versus socialism, but this isn't capitalism or socialism. This is in essence theft of wealth being masqueraded as either capitalism or socialism, and then when it doesn't work, you blame one of the two. But truthfully, it's neither of those ideologies are to blame. It's the idea that it's the wealth is being redistributed at a systemic level.
And I mean, that's one of the reasons. I mean, even biblically, their usury is a sin. Like, why you see something like that, and I've mentioned this before. Why I think you need to almost separate, if you're pro capitalism, separate the usury, because that is not an important cog in that system. People are going to barter and freely exchange. I believe in all that, but when you add this in, this is basically just a tool for wealthy people to become even wealthier, and it's all done sort of under. It's like it's a horrible hybrid of like capitalist and socialist ideas, like it's like the worst of both worlds.
No,
kind of in a way.
I think you're right, Ed, and I think it comes to a point where, or it comes to a head, I guess maybe is a better way to put it, where creating wealth is one thing, and we expect that people are going to do what they can to create and define or redefine their own wealth, but creating wealth on the backs of others in a system that they are born into and have no choice about using is something very different than just simply creating wealth.
Yeah, the problem is this isn't wealth, it's debt. I mean, quite literally, it is creating debt. They're taking no money and lending it to somebody else. That is debt right there. Wealth is you go out and you build something, you make something, you labor for something.
It's tangible.
Yes, that is wealth, and that basically all of that is being transferred upwards.
Bernie Madoff has to be sitting in his prison cell right now thinking, the government can get away with something like this, but I can't.
Yeah, exactly. You know what? Why can't we print our own money and just, that'll end real quick.
Because Ed, essentially speaking, and I'm not a huge Bernie Madoff expert, but that's basically what he got sent to prison for the rest of his life is taking money that didn't exist and investing it into something.
Yep.
And telling people, oh, well, you're at this point right here. And then basically using other funds from other places to pay those people when they wanted to go and, get money out of it.
It's stealing from Peter to pay Paul.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
No, and Adam, you make an excellent point, and I don't think any of us here are defending Bernie Madoff. We're just simply making...
Bernie Madoff is a crook, and
he's a jerk. He
deserves to be where he is. Yes,
and so that's the thing is that I think everybody looks at that situation and basically thinks what you just said, and like the guy's he's a scumbag. Like he deserves to rot in hell because he stole from so many people. But people don't see the Federal Reserve that way. They see it as sort of this like, man, things were so unstable before then, and it's brought stability, and there's going to be ups and downs, and we need somebody controlling it. Bullshit. It very clearly steals from people. Not only that, but the federal government doesn't have control of any of the business cycle that it does manipulate.
No, the federal government itself has to bow to these organizations because they too are in the same debt that we're in.
Yep. It is neither federal nor a reserve. Well, I guess in a small technical sense, some of the banks have some Federal Reserve notes in there, but that's about it. Because we've moved away from the gold and silver standard, which, by the way, may be a silver standard. So the idea of having any sort of, like money is an abstract concept, but we have in the past used things like silver and gold are probably the most common historically, where it represents, and it starts with the goldsmiths, where basically people would go and they would take their gold and they would store it there, and then they would get basically a slip that would say, you have this, and then people started to realize, well, hey, we can just use this slip. That's easier.
Yeah, it's easier to use a piece of paper than carrying around a horse cart full of gold.
Yep, and then kind of eventually, maybe some of the goldsmiths realize, well, hey, I don't even have to keep all of this gold here, too. Like, maybe if I just keep a certain percentage of it, I'll be able to cover all the withdrawals and things like that. But we eventually realized that we could just have, okay, hey, I understand maybe you don't want to take my country's word for it. We have, all of these pounds and pounds and pounds of gold and silver in our treasury over here. And every single one of those, if you take this little slip to us, we'll give you whatever that value is, and you can redeem it for that. So that, our currency is based on something. And so, it was kind of based on that. We're essentially in a world where we're kind of past that. I think you actually could have a fiat currency, which is just to say essentially arbitrary, just based off of the people, which is what we have now. One of the issues that we have is that is the fractional reserve, especially combined with interest, because that's what allows for the creation of all this debt.
And if the Fed was actually a part of the government and actually was, because one has to assume that any part of the government, any cog of the governmental system is, although they might conflict from time to time, that they are in essence working towards the same goal for the betterment of the nation. If they're all part of a nation's government, then one's working towards it. But the Fed doesn't seem to work in that way because the Fed will purposely destabilize the dollar.
Yes. They make their money either way, and they can manipulate it so that they make money. They're gonna lend the money out. It's gonna be created. They're gonna get their 6% plus all of the interest on it. So, one thing bankers really like, war. And if you look at the history of just even before the United States, if there's a war, there's probably a bunch of bankers involved, and a lot of times they're on both sides too. Right. Because what do you do when you go to war? You need money to pay for troops and artillery and everything else, and you borrow money and then you pay interest on it. And you need to rebuild afterwards too.
A common thing that's discussed in history is a thing that goes unrecognized or unexplained, if you will, is that for whatever reason men, when they are put into war, seem to need to eat more. I mean, war doesn't necessarily need more people than you already had. Obviously, you don't. This isn't Star Wars. You don't clone a bunch of people to fight your wars. You're taking from the same people, but they seem to need to eat more, and all of a sudden you need to produce a lot more food and buy and pay for a lot more food, and that is funded by banks.
Just throwing this out there, I don't know, but I haven't looked into it all, but knowing that war is extremely stressful, that essentially increases adrenaline, noradrenaline, things like that, which increase your metabolism. If you're under that for extended periods, you're gonna burn a lot more calories.
I think it's normally, a lot of times it's written off as so much more food is wasted in transit.
Probably that too. Maybe it's not a huge difference. Maybe you're only burning 500 extra calories a day just worrying your ass off.
Or more so that when you're on the government's dime.
Yeah, you pig out.
Yeah.
Well, would that be true nowadays? I mean, people can they eat any more than they already do?
Right, but these are just kind of some things that are kind of discussed. But you're right, Ed. There's a lot of data that shows that every war, basically since Napoleon, has been funded on both ends pretty much by the same banks. The same banks fund both sides of every war since Napoleon, the War of 1812, the Civil War,
World Wars.
Yeah, both the World Wars, the Cold War.
Anthony Sutton, I don't know if you're familiar with him at all. He's written a couple of books. They kind of go into detail about this. Basically, one of them is Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. Another one was Wall Street and Hitler or something like that. And basically about how every time, in those scenarios, these big bankers were funding both sides. They didn't care who won. Or they probably did to a certain extent, but they wanted that conflict.
Mm-hmm.
They basically were pushing for it because you have two sides fighting each other and you're funding both sides. You're just profiting left and right.
Yeah. And, then further, and I know we're getting into the conspiracy realm here to some degree, but when you look at the few nations that are not controlled by these basically worldwide banks, because these banks exist on an international level, and when you look at the nations that are not controlled by said banks, you're going to find nations that you've seen in the news a lot. You're going to see Afghanistan, you're going to see Iran, you're going to see Syria, you're going to see North Korea. And what do these countries have in common? Well, they're the countries that the big countries want to go to war with.
Yep.
And that then they want to go in and they want to win a war against them and they want a nation build afterwards. And what's going to happen when the nation builds? Well, the banks are going to get in.
Yep. There's just like no country with McDonald's has ever fought another country with McDonald's because, bankers are already there.
Right. No, I mean, it's true. I mean, there's so many countries with McDonald's now that I can't imagine that will stay true for much longer.
Yeah, it's possible it might not even be. It was true 10 years ago, but if you look at generally, I mean, we're involved in a lot of these wars, and who are we going to war with? We're going to war with countries that generally don't have McDonald's. And
right.
Who knows? Maybe Afghanistan and Iraq right now have McDonald's popped up there, so maybe it's just that, because it was going on since before the McDonald's was there sort of thing, but I guarantee we're not bombing the area with McDonald's in it.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. So, I mean, Ed, I guess that, are the banks the ones really running the world here?
Pretty much. I mean, especially a few particular ones. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, there's 5 banks with essentially 50% of the cash reserves, which means they basically are responsible for all of that money. They're in control of basically half of all the Federal Reserve notes out there.
Because when you look at that, I know all the tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists, like you and me, in this world, would love to tell you that watch out for the Illuminati and the NWO, because they're going to try to take over and make a new world order here. Are we late to the party on that? I mean, is the NWO already running everything here? I mean, is
the IMF?
Yeah, I mean, is the actual New World Order in place here already, and are we just simply?
Well, maybe that's an issue of semantics, because I mean it's the playbook is, you know, we're pretty deep into it. I don't know that you can say we are 100% there, but you know, a lot of the things are in place, and obviously they use the same plan every time, and it gets them closer and closer every time. What we are seeing here in the U.S. with the Federal Reserve, we're talking about that because it's the biggest one. It's the country we're most familiar with. This same thing happens at banks in other countries. It's essentially the same system. Yeah, I'm sure there are a few differences here or there, but there are other large first world countries with central banks that essentially do the exact same thing.
A famous quote from the Baron Rothschild. Well, that name in itself just screams, "Oh, you're Illuminati, you know, whatever you want to be." But the Rothschilds are real people, and they really do control a lot of banks. Yes. But whether and so do the Rockefellers, and so do a lot of other of these famous, you know, families out there. And you can say, "Oh, your Illuminati stuff is dumb," all you want, but. And that's fine. Fact. But this is fact. These are real people, and they do really own a lot. They're very rich, and they run a lot of banks. But the Baron de Rothschild, who had the 5 sons who he sent off to different countries to, because quite frankly, there just wasn't enough wealth in Western Europe for him to have his 5 sons control things. His famous quote was, and this doesn't necessarily mean that he's satanic and evil and illuminati. No, but his famous quote was, "Put me in control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who makes its laws." And I feel like that's a lot of the ways what the Fed does. The Fed, in a lot of ways, they don't really care what the laws are, because they'll work around or within or without the laws as much as they want, because they already control the money supply. They know that we need money. Mm-hmm. So if the laws change, well, maybe we don't like that law that much, but really we already control the money, so we're going to just shift the way we do business accordingly.
You know, even if we were a very fiscally responsible nation that didn't like to spend and had very few social welfare programs, we would probably still be in a situation where we had to borrow money, because of essentially the devaluing of the dollar would eventually necessitate it. Mm-hmm. I mean, because they have that much control in it, they can cause the boom and bust and retractions and inflations and deflations, and essentially bring about that scenario that they want.
Ed, does gold matter? Is gold money? And is a gold standard a good idea?
I mean, gold obviously has value, whether, you know, no matter what nation you're in, what currency there's a certain value. It does have industrial value. I don't think at this point it would make sense to return to a gold standard. There are too many people, corporations, who probably own vast sums of it. In a way, it's kind of like Bitcoin. Or any cryptocurrency, without even knowing a whole lot about it. There are several people who own large amounts of this cryptocurrency who, if they go to sell and they sell some of it, it makes huge changes in the market. It essentially gives them large amounts of control. It's kind of the same thing with gold. If you go into a gold standard, you're trying to basically make a basis. And I think there are a lot of well-intentioned, well-meaning people who get a lot of things right, who then unfortunately kind of go towards the gold standard. You give those people a lot of control. Your money can basically be manipulated by an outside source again, by going to the gold standard. I think.
Is gold money?
In a way,
This is a question that Ron Paul used to ask people, and just is gold money?
In a way, because if, as I said earlier, money is just an abstract concept for wealth, it will represent that in some form or other. So I guess I would have to say yes. I don't necessarily want it to be my nation's currency, but yes, it is.
Okay. I'm going to go way back to an Alexander Hamilton quote from late 1700s, basically. But he said when people criticize this idea that, we borrow, we do, he said that the system runs on a deficit. It works best on a deficit. How do you feel about that? Does the system run on a deficit? Does it work best on a deficit?
No. I mean, that's complete and utter garbage. How does it work best on it? There's truth to that, I guess. It works best for the people with the money, because when there's that deficit, they're constantly making it. But, I think people like to point to the lending of money and say, well, hey, none of our society wouldn't even exist if we didn't have that. If people hadn't lent them the money to begin with. The reason we exist is because of the hardworking men and women that came before us. It wasn't because some rich person generously decided to rip somebody off with a high interest loan. It was because of the sweat off somebody's brow that they decided to build things, that we built this. I mean, did people colonize this country because they were given loans? They did it for plenty of other reasons, and we would have done it regardless.
What's the old quote? I should have it in front of me. I do not. But what is the old quote that it's often used by people, by biblical scholars? It's often used by others as well. But what you you go to work to buy the bread, to get the energy to go to work, and this is the I'm missing a few steps, because in the actual quote there's more steps to it, and it's much more eloquent, but in essence the idea that you go you go to work to come home to eat the bread, to get the energy to go to work, to and this is the cycle that, quite frankly, that 95% or more of the people on planet Earth that they focus on, that they work on. That's what you do. You wake up every morning and go to work, so you have the ability to wake up every morning and go to work.
Yeah. And when people are constantly working and they're otherwise occupied, they're not thinking. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's basically become just automatons. Sure, it's part of the system of control.
You're preoccupied. You have kids to feed. You got bills to pay. You got mouths to feed. That's ain't nothing in this world's for free. Who sings that song, Adam? I don't remember.
Nothing in this world is for free.
Got bills to pay. I got mouths to feed. Ain't nothing in this world for free.
Oh man,
Sublime. Right?
Cage the Elephant.
Oh.
Cage the Elephant.
Cage the Elephant. Yeah.
I was wrong.
But
is it Rest for the Wicked or something?
Yeah, Rest for the Wicked.
Okay, yeah.
No, I think you made some, I don't know. I think you made some good points here. I know, Adam, I feel like you went into this thinking maybe you were going to disagree with Ed more than you did. And I feel like, and I feel like you're not. I feel like you're not, and that's, I feel like, Ed's, made some damn good points.
No, I think Ed was on point with a lot of what he said tonight.
When the idea of a national bank came into, an old historical term that's used a lot, when the idea of a national bank became something that they thought was practical, is something you still hear, but you hear it as a historical term than an everyday term. But that the idea was that it was not worth a continental. Was an old term which basically meant that our money's not worth anything. Our money's not worth crap. And it was this idea that brought about the idea that we need some sort of federalized, nationalized bank. But in most cases, throughout American history at least, it was then done away with rather quickly. And that isn't the case now. We've had this put into place for a while now, and it seems to just be a commonplace idea that we need this Federal Reserve, we need this national bank, and it hasn't helped us much for purchasing power.
No.
It has not helped us for standard of living. It hasn't helped us at all. And quite honestly, we talked about, the potential funding of the sides of war. I feel like it lends better to our purchasing power, to our standard of living, when we're in the middle of a war. And in peacetime is maybe the worst time for the dollar in a lot of ways, whether that be the American dollar or whatever the equivalent is in other nations. And there's something wrong with that. There's something inherently wrong with that idea.
Yes, especially since people inherently, at least I believe, are peaceful and don't want to be fighting unless they're coerced into it.
Yeah, and to lend something that, historically to it, from 1791 to 1811, when Alexander Hamilton's idea came to fruition for the first Bank of the United States, it at that point almost immediately became the biggest corporation in the country. And it was that idea that people were smart enough to see that made them vote it out in 1811. But now we live in a society where we gave them this power in 1973, and we're not even in a position to vote for it or against it on a regular basis. And that's the difference. Every other incarnation of a national bank before, it was held to a vote every year or two. Sometimes they voted to keep it. Other times they didn't. So yeah, from 1791 to 1811 we have it, but in 1811 they stop it. They voted out of power. It's gone for a while. Only 5 years. But in 1816 to 1836, we have it again. But in 1836, we voted out. It's gone until 1863. And it comes and goes. So it's at least, even if it's inherently wrong, inherently bad, inherently evil, if I dare use that term, at least it was up for discussion and up for grabs. But it's not now. Since 1973, it has been a mainstay of our government without ever being audited, as I'd mentioned, and as Ron Paul has mentioned many times in the past. And it's never even been... It's not like it's being voted on and they've bought and paid for the politicians, so they just vote their way. No, it's not even being voted on anymore.
Nope.
It's not up for discussion. It's not up for grabs any longer. And that was 1973. It's 2018. I'm not getting any younger. I wasn't born in 1973. Nobody here was born in 1973. And here we are. It's there. It's there, and it's not going anywhere. There's very few people in politics even questioning its existence. It's mostly just your fringe people, your Ron Pauls, your Rand Pauls, your Dennis Kuciniches, your fringe people who, quite frankly, I just named a Republican and a Democrat, but they're considered the fringe members of their party.
Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, Bernie Sanders too. Yes. Bernie Sanders, technically not a Democrat. He bridged that gap to try to become that guy. I feel like it was Ron Paul and Dennis Kucinich, and now the standard bearers are now Rand Paul and Bernie Sanders are those guys, but they're considered fringe people in those two parties. people who the party seem to like. Actually, I should say the people voting for the party seem to like those individuals, but the parties themselves definitely tend to want to silence those individuals.
Just go ask Debbie Wasserman Schultz.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
It just kind of goes to show how our two-party system, in a lot of ways, is just a bunch of smoke and mirrors. Like, we maybe at certain points there are bigger issues that they do actually have differences on, but you would think something like this, where, if people actually knew how this worked, you probably have unanimous support from both sides, right. And no one's mentioning it. To me, that shows that a lot of those politicians, because they're not idiots, they're aware of this. They're probably in the pockets of a lot of those banks. At least enough of them are that,
sure.
You have maybe some who would be on the fence about it.
I don't think you're off on that at all. And if anyone out there needs some proof of this, look at what they are doing Look what they're doing right now in New Mexico to Gary Johnson. Gary Johnson is attempting to run for Senate in New Mexico. Now, you would think that the Republicans would rather have an independent in there than a Democrat, and that the Democrats would rather have an independent in there than a Republican. But what they're doing right now, what the Attorney General is doing in New Mexico, by reinstating straight party voting, by silencing these people from the debates, you realize that no, the Republicans would much rather have another part of the duopoly in there, and the Democrats would rather have the other side of the duopoly in there too, than anyone potentially hearing a different, fresh voice in the Senate or in Congress. They've made that very clear. And I don't even think that can be denied. The Republicans and the Democrats are not the two things fighting each other. They're on the side. It's them versus us. It's not Republicans versus Democrats. It's Republicans and Democrats versus the rest of us.
And this is. I mean, you always hear about, Donald Trump talking about wanting to drain the swamp. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is the swamp here. I mean, this is. It is. I mean, this is the swamp that nobody wants to talk about. And I think, Ed, you're absolutely right. I think that this is one of those issues that, if it was talked about more and if it was discussed more, you will get bipartisan support, not from people in Congress. I'm talking about the people, real people in this country. You'll get it from the from the further left people. You'll get it from the further right people as well. You'll be able to get all those people in there agreeing on one common denominator in all of this, and that is that the Federal Reserve serves no common person at all.
No. Yeah. I mean, a lot of that is I think most people don't really understand how it works, or they have a false sense of like, oh, well, it's just sort of like the, United States Bank. We print more money and we lend ourselves. We could just cancel it out if we wanted to, or something along those lines, and no idea that it's basically just a funnel.
And think about what is one of the very few things that, you have a president like George W. Bush and a president like Barack Obama agree on. One of the few things they agreed on was that too big to fail, right?
Yep.
There were certain banks that were just too big to fail.
Yep.
We couldn't let them go down. This isn't new. In 1893, J.P. Morgan stepped in to fix the biggest economic collapse in U.S. history. 1893, we have what's actually the biggest recession ever, more so than the Great Depression. 1893, this happens. J.P. Morgan steps in and says, "No, don't worry.
Yeah,
we'll fix this for you."
I like how history, as it's written by the victors, shows J.P. Morgan as sort of like this champion of the people, this like hero, and it's like, no, he's a fucking banker, just taking over. Like,
yeah. Like he's basically he's the old guy in It's a Wonderful Life saying, "Oh, don't worry, yeah. I got you covered." What's his name in It's a Wonderful Life?
We were just talking about this the other day, weren't we?
George Bailey's the good guy, but I can't think. Potter, yeah, Mr. Potter is the bad guy, and It's a Wonderful Life, who steps in and says, "Oh, don't worry, I'll give you 50 cents on the dollar for all those shares." Oh, you will? What a guy! No, it's like no, he's making 50 cents. If you're giving 50 cents on the dollar, then you're making 50 cents on the dollar on money that's not even yours or doesn't even exist. You know that's what's going on there. So that's a run on the bank. You know, and that's in essence what happens when when we say that banks are too big to fail, or the banks are coming to bail out America. Banks are gonna. Oh, don't worry. Oh, you can't pay for this war? We got you. Don't worry.
When has a bank ever bailed out anybody?
Never.
Banks will be the first person to take, or the first entity to take everything from you.
And hey, that isn't even a criticism of them. They are a money-making entity. They serve no purpose but to make money. So if you want to borrow from a bank willingly because you feel that you can make that back, then the bank didn't do something evil. They simply said, yeah, we'll give you the money and you can pay us back with interest.
Yeah.
But when you put that bank, take that exact mentality and make it, in essence, part of your government, or make your government subservient to them, then you have a real problem now.
I think that's the difference. A lot of people will say, well, hey, typical thing for maybe a teenager, turn 18, early 20s, maybe you get a bunch of credit cards. Obviously, they all have 20% interest, and you rack up a bunch of debt, and it's like, well, hey, maybe that person deserves it. They may have been young and dumb, but they knew the sort of terms and conditions getting into that. In that sense, it's probably true. Mm-hmm. But
and hey, maybe they had some fun too, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and they got something out of it. But when you're born into the system and you have zero ability to control it, that's a little bit different. The best you can do is try to participate in that system as little as possible, but it's nearly impossible to completely abstain from the system in today's age.
It is.
You want to move out and become Amish or something like that, I guess.
Right. No, I mean, people will love to tell you in ours, well, it's not necessary. You don't have to. You could live off the grid. Can you?
It's getting
harder. Can you live off the grid?
It's hard.
No.
You
some people could, but it's not sustainable for everybody.
Right.
Like,
I mean,
I have grandparents that live way out in the country. I could up and maybe just hole up in their hobbit hole. Nobody will know.
Yeah, I admit it. I'd love to live off the grid. Why don't I? I can't. I can't. The minute I can. But the only way it could even get to that level is if I save up some money. And the only way I could save up some money is by working in their system. I personally, I don't know. I know some people that kind of live off the grid. I don't know anyone that got to off the grid without the grid.
Is that what they told you on Facebook?
No. I mean, the people I know that kind of live off the grid got to that point with the grid. They got to that point in the grid.
Are they still the people? Are they still the people that have like the AOL email addresses and the Hotmail email addresses?
Maybe, yeah.
Because that's living off the grid to me.
Yeah.
Something I wanted to point out that you were talking about in the last podcast. If you live off the grid, one of the things you're probably going to have to do, unless you have a stream, is collect rainwater and filter it in some sort. It is actually illegal in a lot of places to do that. Just kind of you would think that's like the most base of homesteading things. Like, okay, I gotta get fresh water. But yeah, you can't even collect your own rainwater because it messes with the local water system.
You actually don't have the right to collect rainwater in a lot of places. You don't have the right to own your own property.
Yeah.
Because you pay off your land, and you still got to pay property tax.
Yeah, say that's they're pretty significant amount. I mean, it's not like it's a small amount, and maybe you can say it's justified. The city provides you services. Should it come in the form of a property tax then? Maybe something else. Maybe it's a different discussion.
Well, as we've discussed on other shows in the past, all of these issues could be fixed if the Republicans actually believe what the Republicans claim to believe, and the Democrats actually believe what the Democrats claim to believe, then all these things could be fixed by a flat tax on purchases.
Yeah.
Every single one of them. But the government doesn't just want your money. The government wants power over you.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line. Because let's face it, if there was just simply a flat tax on everything, then the Republicans should be happy, right? Because now everybody's paying taxes.
Yep.
Except for that, one crazy person who really is collecting rainwater and growing their own bread and everything else. But everybody's paying taxes now. Everybody's got to buy food, right? Everybody's got to buy Pepsi. Everybody's got whatever you buy. Well, everybody's got to be buying it. But the Democrats got to be happy now too, because now the rich are paying far more taxes, right? I mean,
you're talking about flat income tax, right?
Because no, I'm talking about flat sales tax.
Oh, okay. Because if you're talking flat income tax, that usually implied with that is that you get away with all deductions, so it's basically your income.
I would oppose any flat income tax because that is just that goes against your Fourth Amendment right. Then it's infringing on your private.
I just want to point out that would still accomplish the same thing that you're talking about, though, because the rich who basically get away without paying taxes are then actually paying taxes. So it would actually be a way to raise taxes. But then you can get around
it, which I don't have a problem with this. I think this should be a right. You can get around it by working under the table.
Yeah.
But if you have a flat sales tax on goods, then you got to do it. I mean, if you want anything. And hey, if you don't, that should be a right, by the way. If you really do want to grow all your own food.
Yeah.
And collect all your own rainwater, that's great. But if you ever want to go to Subway ever again, you got to pay taxes. But now, one rich person buys a yacht. They just paid more than every working class person they know.
Yeah.
In a day, they just paid more than every working class family, and than 5 working class families.
Depending on the yacht, they might pay more than their yearly income in taxes.
Right. So this goes against it, but they don't just want your money. They want in your business.
Yeah.
They want to know what you're doing. They want to know what's going on. And that's what the Federal Reserve does too. They don't just want your money. Say money is power. No, money is not power. Money can buy some power. But there are plenty of individuals out there that prove that power is better than money. Donald Trump is one of them. Donald Trump didn't need to be president of the United States, right? He's a millionaire. 100 millionaire. Perhaps billionaire. It's debatable, I know.
Got to see your tax returns first.
Exactly.
3, 2, 1.
Yeah. But, I mean, right though? I mean, you got a 70-year-old man who's got $100 million. Why the hell does he want to be president? It's because of power. That's why. All these guys. Who's the last guy to run for president that wasn't rich? If money was power, then why the hell would they want to be president? Money is not power. Power is better than money to the rich. And that's what it boils down to. With the Federal Reserve, with these ideas of liberty, and that's why I know that a flat sales tax. Yeah, you guys know me. I oppose all taxes. Taxation is theft.
Yep.
By the sheer definition of it, taxation is theft. I don't even need to argue it. You can make the argument to me that it's a justifiable theft. Fine.
It's Robin Hood.
But it's theft. It's theft nonetheless. But at least with a flat sales tax on goods, at least you inject some form of voluntarism into your taxation. And there's no data whatsoever to show that you can't collect just as much or more revenue. It's there. It exists. It's really. So what? We live in a culture where we're free, but there isn't quite as many flat screen TVs? That's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. Not bad. Maybe then people realize that flat screen TVs don't last very long, and the manufacturers will be like, "Hey, I'm gonna make a flat screen TV that actually lasts 6 years." Maybe they'll do that, and maybe people will buy it and spend their hard-earned money on that. But I mean, was that off topic? I don't think it was. Not really, but it is. But hey, let's close it up and close it up with as much info as you want, because I don't want to cut you off because you got great info here.
Sorry.
But Adam, closing thoughts on any of this?
Yeah. I mean, it's like I said earlier. I think that when you talk about the swamp in Washington and within U.S. government, I think the Federal Reserve has to be at the top of the list for anybody, just because them being able to make their own rules, and it's really an unfair system. I mean, you hear the president, you hear everybody talking about unfair systems, rigged elections or whatever. I mean, this is truly something that's rigged. I mean, you essentially have big business within the United States being able to basically wipe out their mom and pop small business competition by simply saying that, oh, well, we're going to have inflation. A lot of the times that inflation, well, most of the time it's a phantom inflation. So what do? They raise interest rates. They raise interest rates, which in turn prohibit small business from being able to do what any business will need to do, hire employees, use funds to conduct business. Like I said, whether it's hiring employees, buying new equipment, so on and so forth. And a lot of these, within the Fed, who's on the board within the Fed. It's a lot of big bank executives that are on the boards of these.
They're all millionaires.
Yeah, they're all millionaires. They're all millionaires looking out for the best interests of themselves and other million and billionaires. And that's wrong. And Ed, when you said it earlier, nobody's talking about this. You're absolutely right. Nobody is talking about this, because if they were, there'd be a lot more outcry over stuff like this, and it's not happening, and it's a shame.
Can you imagine if people treated this like the latest Nike ad?
Oh, yeah. So true.
I mean, maybe you'd actually see change, but
final thoughts. What you got?
Don't really have much to add, but I did find a quote by our former president James Garfield that was a couple weeks before he was assassinated. Thought it was interesting. Mm-hmm. This is in like 2 or 3 weeks. Only
president for 3 months.
Yep. Whosoever controls the volume of money in our country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. When you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled, one way or another, by a very few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate.
Excellent quote. Quote.
He was assassinated a couple weeks later.
By a stalwart Republican who wanted Chester A. Arthur to be the president.
Yep.
It was basically at that point in U.S. history, it was almost becoming the two sects of the Republican Party, where Garfield was I guess what you would call a traditional Republican, and Chester A. Arthur was called a stalwart Republican, and kind of like the New Age thing, and Garfield chose Arthur as his running mate, in essence, to unify his own party against the Democrats. So they were going in, and a radical stalwart assassinated Garfield.
Very clearly he was
survived this assassination, but was so mismanaged that. And I'm not even trying to yell conspiracy about that, because that's just kind of how medical care was. I mean, they thought that the best way to save someone in his position was to keep him strong by shoving food up his butt. because that is a good way to give somebody protein and health. So I mean, you're literally, this is the best doctors in the country are shoving pieces of chicken up this guy's ass as he was just shot. And it's like, oh, thanks, guys. That was, way to go, Doc. Thanks for that. But let's say, guys, I don't have a ton of final thoughts here. Ed, I think you brought some excellent data. Is an anti-Trump guy, completely. But you showed today you're unbiased by basically saying that, like, hey, this is a swamp that needs to be drained. You're using Donald Trump rhetoric to say, hey, if that's what Donald Trump meant by draining the swamp, then then.
But he's full of shit though when he goes and he puts bankers and everything on.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, no, that you're trying to here's your swamp, pull the plug. So I really appreciated you saying that, Ed. You had some excellent intel, excellent data today. So the only thing I would even add, I have nothing to add to what these guys said today because I love pretty much everything both of you guys said. If you want more information on this, End the Fed, the book by Ron Paul, is a good starting point. I'm not saying that Ron Paul has every answer to this ever, but might be a good place to start if you're interested in this. It's a good easy read. End the Fed by Ron Paul.
There's a documentary out there. It's kind of old. It's like, I think it's from the 90s, called The Money Masters. It's like 3.5 hours long.
Okay.
They actually kind of go throughout history and basically how it got to the present day, and a lot on the Federal Reserve, and even sort of like maybe they have a different sort of take on what the fix would be, other than, I know Ron Paul's sort of a gold standard sort of guy, but a different sort of take on how to fix the current situation. But a lot of info in there too.
Very good. So I mean, hey, if you're looking for a documentary as a way to broaden your horizons, I just gave one. If you're looking for a print way, Ron Paul's book. If you're looking for a podcast way, re-listen to this show. But hey, everybody, thanks for tuning in. This has been Deep Issues, episode number 25. Come join us second and fifth Tuesday of every month for Deep Issues. Our next, we go to Pumpkin right now, but this is already decided. Our next episode of Deep Issues will be focusing on artificial diseases, or potentially artificial diseases in the modern world. So thanks everybody for tuning in. That'll be episode number 26Z. You can check us out next week right here, Tuesday nights, on theempiremedia.com, where we will have the XCast back in full swing, and we will also, before that, we will have the best podcast in history, where we will discuss historical terms and their relevance. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. We really appreciate it.